again on immigration reform. My name is Sarah Walsh, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society. I have to class at 12, so I'll be very brief and introduce our speakers and thank you all for coming. This event, I think, is really unique. It's not a debate, it's a conversation, marketplace of ideas, if you will, about immigration reform. Not, yes, we want it, no, we don't, and here's why. Here's what's on the table, why it's good, what this side wants more or less of, and all these proposed reforms. That being said, there are sign-in sheets. If you could please sign in as they go around, and then we're going to have our main speaker, Mr. Stuart Anderson, speak up to 25 minutes, and then our commenting professors, Professor Jones, no introduction, and Professor Bourdreau, who is our visiting clinical foreclosure mediation clinic professor. I hope I got that right. They can give you a little bit of background as well when they come up to speak. We'll be open for questions at the time when they come up after they comment. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. Without further ado, I will introduce Mr. Stuart Anderson, who is the executive director of the American National Foundation for American Policy. And again, he'll speak for about 25 minutes. We will have a hard break at 12:50, so you can all get to class. We ask you to stay seated until that point. So, without further ado, Mr. Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of immigration, then talk about what reforms I think Congress should make, and then talk about what reforms Congress will make on immigration. Not that long ago, I was watching TV and Lord of the Rings came on, and there was a part in there that I hadn't really remembered before, where one of the characters says, the penalty for entering Gondor without permission is immediate execution. They really had strict immigration policies. But the irony is, you come out back then and talk about the United States, not only are there strict immigration policies, there were no immigration policies. People can go to Mayflower, Jamestown, or obviously they get a visa first. You go through the Revolutionary period and still no restrictions on immigration in the United States. War of 1812, American Civil War, still no restriction. You have to go all the way up to 1882 to find the first restriction on immigration to the United States. And that was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was aimed at preventing people from China from both immigrating and nationalizing in the United States. And it was an important precursor to the later restrictions we saw about 40 years later, because these were racially and ethnically based restrictions, and that's what we saw in 1921, and then it became permanent in 1924, the National Origins Clause. And those were aimed at specifically trying to prevent people from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Russians, particularly Jews, from being able to immigrate. And really the theory behind it was a popular intellectual movement at the time called the eugenics theory, and it was aimed at preventing certain people, certain races or ethnicities from either being born or being, or in this case, immigrating to the United States. There was even a lively intellectual debate about the proper skull sizes that immigrants would have. And this is, in this type of kind of pseudoscience, pretty much governed immigration policy up until 1965. Between 1924 and 1965, there were these very severe restrictions. And to give you an idea how important removing these national origins quotas are to really what even the country looks like today, if it wasn't for removing the national origins quota, anybody going in India or China or South Korea, basically they wouldn't be able to be in the United States, or the families wouldn't be able to come because there was something called the Asiatic Barred Zone, Asia, immigrants to the United States. If you go forward, the next really big piece of legislation after 65 was in 1986. There was the immigration law that gave an amnesty to people who were in the country illegally, but it also, for the first time, made it legal to hire someone who was in the country illegally. And if any of you ever filled out the I-9 form, that's really where that comes from. from the 1986 law. 1990, there was actually an increase in both family and employment-based immigration, and in 1996, there was an attempt to cut legal immigration in the original bill, but it was fought back, and that aspect of the bill was defeated by a combination of kind of Reagan conservatives and liberal Democrats. So what ended up in the 96 bill was really mostly aimed against illegal immigration and making it harder for people, once they were in illegal status, to ever regularize their status in some way. And really since then, there was some visa tightening after the 9/11 attacks, but otherwise there mostly just been attempts to have bigger reforms to immigration, such as in 2006 and 2007, attempts that failed. And then last year he finally had a large-scale bill that passed the Senate, and there's pending action in the House, and all that I'll get to. But so that's really a quick legislative history. But other things were happening besides what Congress was doing. If you go to 1942, you had the first agreement this kind between the U.S. and Mexico to allow bracero workers, which are agriculture workers who would come into the United States to work during the labor shortages of World War II. And that became particularly important in the early 1950s when there became the first big concerns about illegal immigration. There's an INS commissioner at the time named General Swing, and he went down to the border and he told the growers, he said, look, we're going to have a crackdown on illegal immigration. But at the same time, we are going to make it easier to use the bracero program because we want to replace the illegal flow with a legal flow of workers. And that's exactly what happened. The bracero admissions increased in combination with this crackdown on that border. But again, the crackdown wasn't anything near the number of personnel you have today along the border. With the bracero admissions increasing, really doubling and then almost tripling, you really saw one of the great social science experiments of the 20th century. Really answering the question, would people come in legally if you gave them the option to do so? And the answer really was yes. Really the way we measure illegal entry is by apprehensions to the border. It's a proxy. And in 1953, you had about 1 million apprehensions to the border. By 1959, it dropped to 40,000. In other words, illegal entry basically dropped by 95% as the legal admissions to bracero increased. So it's really, by far, the most successful effort ever made to reduce and almost largely eliminate illegal entry into the United States. 95% drop. But unfortunately, what happened was the braceros weren't necessarily treated that well. People were concerned also about competition. People like the labor unions were concerned about the competition. And so that combination ended up ending the bracero program by 1964. Rather than replace it and address some of the issues that it raised, and particularly have an additional way for people to come in and work legally outside of agriculture, there basically was nothing. So what happened to illegal entry? Well, apprehensions increased by 1,000% between 1964 and 1976. In other words, while it went like this in the 50s, it went like this starting in the 60s. And that's really the concerns about illegal immigration that we see up to the present day. So what was eventually the response to that increase in illegal immigration? Well, in the early 90s, we started to see a response really aimed at action by the Border Patrol. It was really twofold. It started to increase in the personnel, and in a way, the way they were deployed was to emphasize deterrence, so to push people into more dangerous areas, out into farther out areas. To give you an idea of the numbers, the Border Patrol buildup started, you had about 3,500 Border Patrol agents in the early 90s. That went up to about 5,000 and 10,000 during the Bush administration, really 15,000 again in the Bush administration, up to 21,000 during the Obama administration, and now the Senate passed a bill that were to become law, it would increase that another 20,000 up to 40,000. I'm really not sure where it's going to cost. There's really a lot of good jobs out there in the Border Patrol. Fastest growing occupation in America. But has this been a successful way to prevent illegal immigration? Well, the answer really is no. I mean, we all know about the concept of unintended consequences. Now, we have them in our own life. We do something and something unintended happens. But when the government does something, unintended consequences tend to be very large. And in this case, this is exactly what we saw. What happened was, as it became dangerous to make into the country. Once people got in, they tended to stay. So basically we replaced a circular migration, which came for a while and back, with really a permanent migration. So when this bill of the Border Patrol started, you had about 3.5 million people in the country legally. Today you have 11.5 million people in the country legally. So when you read the paper about what do we do about the 11 million or whatever number of people choose to use of people who are undocumented, that's really the story of how this came about. And it is definitely more dangerous because I did some research last year that showed the number of deaths reached almost 500 in 2012, the second highest on record. And with actually fewer people trying to come into the country, I calculated that someone was about 8 times more likely to die trying to get into the United States today as they were maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So it's a serious issue, and it's a twofold issue of why really I think the most important reform that can be made is having legal work visas for people who work in jobs, and some I consider lower skilled jobs in construction, hotels, restaurants, because there's a humanitarian factor which would save lives and virtually eliminate, I think, the deaths at the border. And also, it's proven to be by far the most effective way to reduce illegal immigration. So we don't really recreate this problem again, which is really what happened in the 86 Act, where they did do an amnesty, they did try to do more enforcement, but they didn't really have a way, a market mechanism of any sort for people to come and work legally. So the next big reform that really needs to be made is on high-skill immigration, both increasing the number of temporary visas and increasing the number of green cards. The reason that is a very important reform is if any of you go to a college campus, you'll find in graduate schools, such as electrical engineering, that about 70% of graduate students in electrical engineering are international students. When you look at some other fields like computer science, it's about 63%, and many other of the science engineering fields, it's over 50%. So it's really not an issue of being nice to the international students, because the international students are going to get other opportunities to work. The question is whether they're going to work in the United States and have more jobs and investment take place in the United States. If they're not able to be hired in America, they're going to get hired overseas, and that's where more the jobs and investments and innovation will take place. The reason this issue, the immigration issue, becomes so important is when companies do recruit, they typically have to use what's called an H-1B temporary visa, with visas that are used up every year, maybe for the past 11 years, before the end of the fiscal year. So this past year, for example, all the numbers were used up about 6 months before the fiscal year started. What happens in that case? Well, either the person doesn't get hired in the U.S. or they get hired abroad. They might be able to stay for a while. It's called optional practical training. But again, all of these things are second best options, and the preference is that they get hired in America and they start their career here. Now, even if they are able to start their career, they also, if they want to stay permanently, the company wants to petition for them permanently, they'd have to get a green card, and the waits for that is sometimes 6 to 10 years or more. And it's also important for things like entrepreneurship. I found that there were students at the University of Maryland who had almost won an entrepreneur contest. They went to the attorney and said, we'd like to make this permanent. Unfortunately, the attorney told them, no, we're not going to be able to. The immigration service isn't going to be able to approve that. So therefore, basically, we're told to just make a company. 2 of the people left the country, another one won the diversity visa lottery, and the 4th one ended up working for Microsoft. So the 2 that were still in the country got together and we started fooling around with Facebook apps, and eventually they were able to create the company. This was like 10 years later. They were creating a company called Zeus, which is a big online internet dating site. Actually, they're going to be publicly traded maybe later this year, so that people understood that. But the point is, this is an opportunity that they wouldn't have had. Both of them were from Iran. I'm sure they would have been able to set up this big internet dating site in Iran, but they certainly were able to set it up in the United States and employ a lot of people, provide provide service. A lot of times the contributions that people make immigrants make maybe aren't even immigrants themselves, but it could be for their children. I went to the Intel Science Talent Search competition one year and interviewed the parents and the students. And this is the top science students in America in high school, and found that 70% of them were the children of immigrants, 70% were fatherless. One family in particular stuck out, family, Hackman family, father had brought the family here around the time when I told many of them are Iran, the family was Jewish, and they didn't feel that it was going to be safe to be in Iran. One of the children, Michelle, was actually born in America, but she originally first born, she only had eyesight in one eye, and she actually lost sight in her second eye and became blind. Born on September 11th, in Long Island. So she ended up participating in this Intel Science Talent competition. Actually came in second in the competition for her project. It was measuring the anxiety level of teenagers when separated from their cell phones. And she was able to train researchers to help her analyze that. And it's really sort of a great example of how really opportunity can come about and extend to the children. Because I think the Hackman family knew that if Michelle was born in Iran, she really would have been in a difficult situation. Jewish, woman, and blind, three categories of people that aren't really dealt with for equality in Iran. Whereas in America, she comes in second in the leading high school competition. She's going to Yale, she's pursuing a PhD, and again, she has the opportunity that she wouldn't have had if her family had come to America. So these two reforms on both high skill immigration and low skill immigration are crucial. And really, though, if you want to look at it, what needs to happen to get those across the finish line is addressing the situation of people who are here illegally. I didn't focus on that as like sort of a key reform because I view that in many ways as more of a practical political issue as much as anything else. So let's look at what has happened so far in these three areas. Low skill visas, the Senate has passed a long bill that's over 1,000 pages long, and it starts with only about 20,000 low skill work visas, partly because of the compromise with some of the unions. I think that's a mistake to start at such a low level. It's really not enough to address the situation of the people who are dying trying to come in, and also really to have a big impact on illegal immigration. So you recreate the problems that we've already had with illegal immigration. The House does not have a bill yet on that. They've passed some bills through the House Judiciary Committee, but have not passed a bill on that yet. And we don't know what the numbers are going to be. Chances are, when they do put forward a bill, it'll be much higher, and that would set up a potential conflict between the House and Senate on that issue. On high school visas, the Senate has actually very good measures in which they would eliminate the entire book-based green card backlog, which is very important. And in addition, on temporary visas, both the House and both the Senate passed bill increases H-1B visas, as does the House Judiciary Committee version that passed the Judiciary Committee. That would increase H-1B visas as well. But the Senate version has maybe more bureaucratic revisions, at least from the company's perspective, than the House version. And also the House also doesn't increase green cards nearly as much as the Senate for employers. So, what's about the situation of those who are in the country legally? Well, what the Senate has done is pass a series of revisions that really would divide the legal immigrant population into three categories. One would be people who fall into the DREAM Act category, people who are volunteers, children. Second, people who came here and have been working in agriculture. And third, that would be everyone else category, which people would have to work maybe an additional 10 to 12 years, pay fines, undergo other screening. And all told, according to the Congressional Budget Office, it would have maybe, at a maximum, maybe 8 million people might be looking for green cards out of that total, although it might be, depending how long this process takes, it could be getting closer to 6 years. I did an analysis looking at the House side, which hasn't introduced any legislation on that aspect yet. But they have talked about a process in which they would legalize people, and would give them legal status, but only those people who fit in through one of the family or one of these categories would be able to get a green card. Interestingly enough, fitting through the family categories, the way that most people under such a scenario would be able to get a green card would probably be as the parents of U.S. citizens. And that's because about 4.5 million illegal immigrants have a U.S.-born child, which is an amazing statistic, but it really speaks to how long this population's been here. Really about 10 million, about 11 million, 11.5 million authorized immigrants have been here a decade or more. And that really also speaks to the idea of how likely it is for people to simply leave, particularly if they have family here. I think in reality, they're probably very unlikely to leave voluntarily. And quite frankly, even if they're deported, there is really no certainty that there would be very strong attempts to try to get back into the United States as well to rejoin the family. When you get to the issue, so really what the issue though is the term path to citizenship is often used, but really the correct term really is more like a path to a green card and path to permanent residence. Because once you get permanent residence, then after 5 years you can apply for citizenship. And interestingly enough, only about 40% of the people who receive green cards under the 86 amnesty ended up getting citizenship. So it's not necessarily something that everyone is aiming for. Is there something already, I think, for a typical person who's in the country legally, who has a family, and is driving around and concerned about getting stopped. Another status that just allows them to stay here, and not be deported, and be able to work and maybe travel freely, might be sufficient for them, at least for the time being, versus having no bill, versus no legislation at all that wouldn't really change their situation at all, which would still keep them in fear of deportation. So what do I think is finally going to happen with all this? Well, I think if you look at these three areas, I think on low-skill visas, I think there's a good chance that Congress will overall pass a bill. I think it's still probably only about a 50-50 chance of it happening, but certainly the prospects are much brighter than they've been ever before, particularly because of some of the actions that House leadership have taken, recent principles that were announced, a lot of activity that indicates that there's a seriousness going forward with legislation at some point during the year. So on low-skill visas, I would picture that there are not going to be as many visas as many businesses would want, or even as I would want, to help reduce illegal immigration in the future, but I still think it would probably be an improvement over the status quo, because it'll at least become a category for people to enter for some of these other jobs, construction, and hotels and restaurants, things like that, and possibly be something to build on in the future. High-skill visas, again, I think it will be an improvement of the status quo, but it won't be as many high-skill visas or green cards as a lot of employers would want to help support that funds in the future. And legalization, I think there will not be as many people possibly who would get green cards, and but some people fall path to citizenship as a lot of advocates would want. But I think some segment of that population would get it, particularly people who came here as young people, going over their parents. And other people, though, might get a chance to just stay here without a fear of deportation. If that were to be the case for that population, it's going to be an improvement over the status quo. So what this probably means is that I can come here and in a couple of years, there's still really a lot to talk about. So why don't we turn it over to Mr. Evans?
So I'll just try to keep it to a couple minutes. I don't have a lot of comments. I'll just say a couple preparatory things. One, this is an important issue for me. I am the grandchild and great-grandchild of immigrants from Mexico on my mother's side. So Latin American immigration is kind of at the center of a lot of these controversies. And so for me, it's a very personal issue. I think my hope is that as a country we won't let xenophobia sort of cloud our judgment when we try to decide what to do. I fear that happens sometimes. In my opinion, we're the most successful country on the planet in terms of what we've done and contributed across the board, technology, business, art, music. And that's because of the people who came here, right? The people who have come here in the past and the people who are still coming here today. The only people who came here in the past were basically the people who had the courage to leave everything behind and risk their lives. And we tend to laud the people who did that in prior centuries, in particular places like Europe, but it's still happening today. It's just happening more frequently from Latin America. And the people who live in Latin America still have the same characteristics and still the same types of people that we laud from the past. They're still risking everything. They're still particularly tough, determined, strong people who have the ability to leave everything they know and are comfortable with behind to make a better life for their children. And so for me, there's a lot of similarities between the people who are still coming here today and the people who came in the past. I think the similarities sometimes are lost in the debate. I know people will say that the people who came in the Mayflower, big difference is they came legally. I don't really see the distinction. The people who came in the Mayflower they didn't really immigrate, they invaded, right? And they had no legal or moral right to displace the people who lived here, so I don't really see a distinction there. Some people say that Latin American immigrants have faced the same criticism that all the prior immigrants faced. There's the argument that we're not assimilating as much as other groups, but that's always been the case. The Italian Americans had the same criticisms when Italian Americans came over. In 1924, there was a law that tried to limit Central and Eastern American Europeans because of this idea that they were different or not as good or weren't assimilating, because there were these pockets in all these metropolitan areas of Little Italy's. But now, I mean, those Scalia and Alito are the grandchildren of those people. I mean, assimilation always happens, it always has, it always will. And so I just don't see any differences in those respects. So, I thought your talk's very informative, so I'll stop so other people can talk instead of being a chance to ask more questions about what's going on, because I don't know as much about the current forms of debates that are occurring.
So, I think that there are a couple things that I really just wanted to add to the discussion, and I think that they're important. A lot of the exposure that I come to for immigration issues really fall in the category of family law. So for those of you who know, I was a practicing attorney, and a lot of my practice was in family law before I came to Northern. And so when I look at this, I look at it from a number of different perspectives. And one of the things that I look at, and as I think about it, is that there's a lot about this immigration situation that we're in at the moment, where we have 11.5 million people who don't have status, who really every day are being forced to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. So for instance, there are a lot of folks who don't have status who work very hard to make sure they pay their taxes. And when they pay their taxes, they often do it under a social security number that they have gained illegally. If they ultimately get to a point where they can legalize their status, they then have this situation where they have to have paid their taxes. So there's this sort of situation we have that in many ways reminds me of prohibition, where we've decided that something is really bad, and so we put a prohibition against it. But we've got all of this stuff going on under the surface that's in effect making people who are trying to raise their families or work for a living or whatever, putting them in a situation where they're constantly acting outside the law. And I think that one of the things that I think is important as we look at this is that this group of folks who are already here, many of them have been here a long time. They have a lot of ties to the community. And they really have become and participate as an integral part of the American experience. And I think that we're going to continue to see that happening. There's some discussion about what happens if we don't lock down the borders. So some of the discussion that we've heard happening and going on is really this, we can't do anything with this part until we absolutely make the borders secure. And I think that our speaker was exactly right, that as we have tried that approach, we haven't necessarily been as successful at keeping people out, but we have been successful in driving them into more dangerous situations and other things. So I think that what I'm hoping to see come out is really something that tries to balance some of these needs. That we do have a need we clearly have a need for skilled workers. We train a lot of the world's talent, and then we send them back to help other countries and other economies. And I think we want the opportunity to keep as many people here as we can. But we also need workers of all kinds, skilled, unskilled, moderately skilled. And I think that what happens is that we can allow those workers, those entrepreneurs, and these other folks to help generate jobs. There's a lot of concern in various areas about what's going to happen to jobs. Are undocumented workers taking jobs? Will they take jobs? How does that affect unionization? How does it affect other things? And I think that what we need to look at is how we can help everyone create jobs and create those opportunities. So I think that in those areas, I think it's important. What I think is going to happen in DC, I will be surprised if we get immigration reform this year. I would love to see it. I had high hopes. I think there's a chance that if we get immigration reform, we will get it in December, in one of the last waves of, enough people are leaving Congress that now they can vote however they want to vote. That's my prediction on it. But I think that the politics of immigration have become really fixed, partially because there is a belief and a fear that, especially with immigrants that have been here outside of legal status, that if you legalize them, they all vote for one party. And I think that's a missed opportunity, honestly, because I think that when you look at the vast numbers of immigrants around the country who are here both who came here through proper channels or who came here undocumented, I think what you really see is that if you can get past, if everyone can get past that immigration status, then there's a lot more flexibility within parties for people to say, okay, the parties, I'm glad that this party supported immigration, but I'm more aligned with this party. And so I think over time, that kind of works its way out, is my take on it. But I think it's what's going to hold up immigration in this election. That's my thoughts.
Well, why don't we open up for some questions?
Could you explain, like in the employment context, how the system currently works as far as, things such as Social Security and taxes for illegal immigrants or legal green cards versus citizens, and what you would expect would change about that in the legislation?
Well, as the professor was talking about, a lot of people who are in the country legally are often using a Social Security number that doesn't match up with themselves, which means that even if they're paying into it through those taxes, they're probably never going to see that money. If someone was to be here legally, eventually they would probably be able to access some of these benefits. So in some ways that would increase some of the payments to them. But on the other hand, the way our Social Security system works, it's a pay-as-you-go system, which means that more workers are really essential to keep the system going. Current workers basically pay for the money that funds current retirees. Even though members of Congress may talk about that there's a account, people have accounts. We kind of have accounts, but it's more kind of kept in a ledger somewhere. It's not really money that's sitting there. So to get that money, you have to get it from current workers. And basically, if you look at the Social Security actuary report every year, they give different figures on immigration and basically say more immigration is more beneficial to the Social Security system because of the way we have a pay-as-you-go system. If we had a different type system, they might have different calculations. But because we have a pay-as-you-go system, more workers simply are very positive for the Social Security system.
I have two questions. One is, what lessons can we learn from the amnesty program that we had in the 80s? And how long do you think that worked? What lessons can we derive from our experiences there? And the other is, a number of people in the Republican Party want to create some sort of legalization for people who are currently here without a path to citizenship. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what, if anything, is the significance between those two different options you were talking about? And that's point of view or view?
Well, two really good questions. On the 86, I mean, it's really one of the most important questions where someone will say, well, why should we legalize people who are in the country now? Because we did that in 86 and it didn't work. But the issue of what didn't work is that what was left out of the 86 law, what was left out was, as I was alluding to, was any legal way for people to come in and work in lower skilled jobs. There was no provisions made, particularly for people in construction, hotels, restaurants. And those are the jobs, typically, that are being filled by people who are in the country illegally, year-round jobs. There are some seasonal visas for agriculture, but that's considered very bureaucratic, and a lot of people don't end up even using those. And there's something called H-2B, which is for resorts and that type of work. But for full-year jobs, which are typically what unauthorized immigrants are working at, there's no visa category. So if you simply legalize people, similarly to what you did in 86 or through some other mechanism, and don't create sufficient numbers for new visas in a new category that would allow people to work legally, you're really not going to solve the problem. We already know that just increasing the number of Border Patrol agents and some other enforcement ideas that may be out there is really not enough to prevent illegal immigration. What it does is if it changes the patterns of illegal immigration, it may push people to more dangerous areas, but then it has this large unintended consequence that people don't go back and forth, and once they get here, they end up staying, which creates other issues and other concerns in communities on other issues. So that would be the most important lesson learned from 86, is that you have to have a legal way for people to come in. Otherwise, just adding enforcement or just legalizing people doesn't really solve the problem. On the issue of what are the different options, I would say that I think people need to realize that even the Senate bill will not result in all 11.5 million people getting a green card. That the way it would work is through all these different mechanisms. At most, 8 million out of 11.5 million would probably get a green card according to CBO. And even then, because of the length of time the process takes, they're looking really more at probably practically closer to 6 million or so would probably end up getting it. I think if you did a poll of people who are in the country legally, I think there have been some of those types of polls, that many of them put a higher priority on just on the shorter term benefit of not being deported and not being separated from the family, being able to work and travel. I mean, that raises kind of democracy type questions about, do you want to have a system where many people aren't allowed, aren't able to have the potential to become citizens? In many ways, for the person who's, if you were their client and they're the ones that are risking, the deportation, you may feel it's better as a whole for the country if they had a chance at becoming citizens. But if you're representing them in their most immediate interests, you would probably also think it would be a good thing that at least in the near term, that the threat of deportation be removed from them. And so I think that you will see if there's a deal on the table in which many of the people have a chance of getting to stay here without being deported, even if not as many people get green cards and a chance of citizenship, that there'll be a lot of pressure put on Democrats to take that deal if the rest of the bill is considered.
That's a real increase in not only the path to citizenship, but one of the statistics or one of the comments made was that it was surprising that a lot of people that had green cards did not actually get their citizenship. And I can understand, original information, I can understand why they wouldn't do it, because they still have, they could lose their citizenship in their country. But the question we have since now, I believe, I don't know if I'm correct, like a DUI misdemeanor would actually deport anybody with a resident alien card or a misdemeanor. Has there been an increase for actual citizenship applications from people that have the resident alien cards?
I mean, I think it's consistently there's been people who have lawful permanent residence from all different nationalities, trying to become citizens. I don't know that it necessarily gets spurred on by some of the issues you're raising. Sometimes it gets spurred on by hearing things like the fees are going to go up higher, and if you were putting it off, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and do it. I think you're right that contiguous countries maybe have an issue where people are more likely to feel that they're going to go back someday, and that's one reason that getting citizenship would be kind of the final realization that they're never going back. But I think obviously a lot of people do want to become citizens. I mean, I've spoken at naturalization ceremonies. It's very moving. People are very serious about it. But just everyone's situation is different. And that's why when I was talking about sort of the people who are here as a whole, that there are going to be a lot of people who it's just not going to be in their mind that that's their first priority if it's a choice between the potential being to stay here and not be separated from family members versus the possibility, if a different bill passed, to be able to have a chance of getting a green card citizenship. And don't forget, even if you get a green card, you still have to wait generally 5 years and have the English language requirements and a citizenship test and pass up the criminal checks and things like that. So it's not automatic.
Just to add, I think that one of the things, I don't have the statistics either. I think one of the things that often happens, and I saw a lot when I used to do some immigration clinic work and sort of legalization, helping people fill out their applications for citizenship, is that very often you have families, neighborhoods, or systems where you have a mix of people in status. So you will have some people who might be citizens, some people who might be legal permanent residents, and some people who are here completely out of status. And so this, I think this, what I was talking about earlier, this situation where you have this sort of class of people that are constantly risking being lawbreakers, is that I think that sometimes carries over to the folks who do have status, because I have definitely talked to people who have certain fears that, maybe they're here legally, but, they're not sure about their sibling who isn't here in the same status. And so I think that builds a distrust of working with the system. I think that may be part of what pulls down the numbers of folks who go for that status change as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. There is a lot of that. Hughes Hispanic Research Centers has some different data, and some which I've used, where even with people who fall into the Dream Act category, where the parents brought them here, and they are still in unlawful status, the parents have often been here long enough that many of them have U.S.-born siblings. So their sibling is fine, they can do everything that any of us in this room can do, but the person who falls into this Dream Act category can't, and has a much more limited future unless, while there's some temporary relief under what the Obama administration did, that in the long term, they're really in a very tough situation. If they were brought here young, don't really know the country they left from, but really can't be even employed legally going forward on a permanent basis unless there's some change in the law. So. Yes.
My question's a little bit broad, so I apologize if it comes out a little bit odd. Mine has to do with the high school immigration, where I'm used to a concept of something called brain drain, where we educate a large number of the world's, people with master's degrees, PhDs, and a lot of them reside here. And as a country in the G20 actually finances and tries to bring up the lowest countries around the world. At what point does the immigration reform help get those people back to the countries they came from so they can start building their own countries as well?
Well, it's an interesting concept, sort of the brain drain that we're kind of taking from other countries. I really think that each individual is going to have a choice around the world where they go to live. If they get educated in the U.S., they should have a choice, as long as it fits within the country's immigration system, to be able to work in the United States. I think even if the U.S. was to make an attempt to say you have to go back to your home country, in many cases, the people are highly sought after, so they'll get an opportunity in Australia or Canada or some other country, even if we try to have a policy of kind of pushing people back to their home country. I think naturally, a lot of people, say from India and China, are going back to their home country. In some cases because there's legitimate economic opportunities. In other cases because certain opportunities have been foreclosed in the U.S. because of our immigration system. I think ideally we want to have an immigration system that recognizes these people are very beneficial. But if they choose to go back to their home country, then certainly that's their decision. In many cases, for the home country, it can be very beneficial that someone works in the U.S. and they form networks back and forth. This is a great deal in India. In fact, I've seen a good deal of literature and quotations from, say, that the people who are behind the reforms in India that moved the country really were from a socialist economy to a much more market, from a full market economy, but much closer to a full market economy. And really saying that one of the big influences was the fact of having these students from India studying in the U.S., sending them information back, talking with parents, and in some ways even embarrassing the elite in India about the differences between, say, the U.S. and India, that was a real spur for economic reform, and it's really lifted, really tens, if not hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in India. So in many ways, people voting with their feet can be a very effective way to send a type of market signal to the leadership of a particular country that they need to get their act together, because you're not going to be able to retain the next generation of people, young people, if they don't really have, come up with enough reforms to make their economy viable. So it's kind of a much more dynamic situation.
Just a short comment. Thank you to all speakers for speaking on this topic today. I just want to talk about my personal story a little bit, to present sort of the human side of it, the personal side of this issue, which I think a lot of people be very kind of abstract, very far away. I'm actually documented too well, and so this issue is really personal to me. And the only thing I would say, the argument I would say is that by not doing anything, by not having the courage and asking our legislators to do something about this issue, we in fact have default tendencies. And we have in the last 10, 20 years. So, thank you to the speakers and
Sure.
Thank you so much for doing this. I can't wait to watch the YouTube video. I know there are a ton of other people who really wanted to be here, but had to be in class, unfortunately. That being said, I'd like to thank our speakers and our guests, and keep a couple dates in mind for upcoming events and topics. We're going to do something on parentage rights as it pertains to sort of modern reproductive technology. That will be February 26th. We're looking at March 24th, April 10th in the evening at 5 o'clock, and then Scotch and Cigar Night, our social event will be coming up. We'll have a date for that as well. Any questions, anytime you see one of us in the hall, just stop us. And thanks for Elsa for hosting this with us. So, I'm giving it over.